So in this lecture, I just want to go over some of the the components of the organic certification program sponsored by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. In the previous lecture, I talked just very briefly about the the history of how it came about, and it essentially was an initiative by USDA to try to bring the entire country under some kind of standards and guidelines, pretty much because, and it was at the request of a lot of growers and suppliers and consumer groups, all concerned about the lack of a a unified standard or measure or guide for what is organic and what isn't. There's still some controversy and criticism, I guess, to a certain degree about the program, about the guidelines. Are they strict enough or not strict enough? And that's really kind of up to the individual, at least from a consumer point of view, as to whether you think those guidelines are strict enough. As a gardener, for the most part, a gardener is not going to be selling produce to anybody, and is not necessarily interested in having their food or harvest labeled as certified organic. But the program itself provides useful information in the form of guidelines, in the form of this list of materials that can and can't be used. And so even if you're not going to be growing on a scale or even growing to sell organically, having some idea of what those standards are can be useful. From a consumer point of view, knowing the guidelines is helpful because at least you know when you see that label, you know what it means. And we've already talked about how the word organic means different things to different people. It still does to this day, and there are still, like I said, people that maybe say that the organic USDA standards are not strict enough, and they may not, they may choose not to do certain things, particularly in the area of certain chemicals applied or certain practices. And then there are some people that maybe are not, particularly a gardener who's not particularly worried about selling the produce that way, but they still would like some kind of a reference or guide. So the standards do provide kind of a framework to return to. And so we're going to go over them just so you understand kind of what they are in a kind of a general sense, and how the program is implemented. And we'll start with the definition of organic, and I've already read this to you before, so I'm not going to read it again. But basically, the idea of kind of an environmentally based, biologically based practices that promote ecological balance. And that is the kind of the fundamental definition that the USDA program uses. To become certified, it begins with an application to an accredited certifying agent, and in every state that can be different. And they're going to want to know, like, basically they want a detailed description of the operation, and they're looking for at least a 3-year history of all the things that have been applied, what's happened to the land, how it's been grown, what crops are going to be grown or raised or processed. And then they're going to want to see some kind of a written plan. So we're going to kind of go through these steps in a little bit more detail, but basically they want to know what's going on. And the only way they can find that out is through this application process. And so the process basically begins by a producer or handler choosing to adopt an organic practice, and they submit an application and the fees to the certifying agent. The certifying agent, which is typically some agency or whatever, and there's usually a representative or a person that works for that reviews the application, verifies that the practices fit, do they, all the things this farmer or grower or processor says they're doing, do they all fit into the regulations and guidelines? There's an on-site inspection to make sure that, yes, there is this operation, and yes, it, generally looks like they're following the rules. Obviously, once the inspector is gone, the farmer could do whatever he wants to, but there is an effort made to verify on the ground what's happening at the farm. And then the certifying agent reviews the application and the inspector's report, and then determines whether the grower or processor complies with these regulations. And if they do, and they meet all the guidelines, then the certificate is issued. There was at least at the time I looked this up, there was 55 certifying agents in the United States, scattered around the country. In the state of Georgia, we just have one. In some states, there might be 3 or 4. In some areas, there might be one person working 2 or 3 states, if it's really small states like Rhode Island or something, or in areas where there's a less dense population. There is an annual fee. Different certifiers charge different fees. Typically, the fees run $600 to $1,000. But then there's an application fee as well. So it can end up costing $1,500 to $2,000 for this all to kind of come about. In theory, a grower can go to any certifier. In reality, they tend to go to the one in that individual state who's familiar with the environment and conditions, availability of materials, and so forth that are within that state. It would be unusual for a Georgia grower, say, to get somebody, maybe somebody from Alabama if they're close to the Alabama border, but it'd be unusual for them to get somebody, say, from Virginia or Pennsylvania or California. You'd have additional costs for transportation, if nothing else. The certifying agent verifies that these practices and they're looking primarily at like fertility, fertilizers, pest control is a big thing. They're looking at the overall practices, and then they're gonna, they actually want to see a list. So you have to give them a list of everything that you put out there, everything that you've sprayed over the past 3 years on that land. Any chemicals, even if they're certified organic chemicals, they're still considered chemicals. What did you spray? How much, and for what crops, and for what purpose? And the idea is to make sure that the products are being used for their intended purpose, that you don't have some crazy person using the wrong materials at the wrong times of year or for the wrong purposes. In a way, it's a kind of an effort to make sure that the farmer is a reasonably intelligent individual following recommended practices. I mentioned before, and I always get this acronym mixed up, it's the Organic Materials Review Institute. I always want to call it the Research Institute. They don't actually do any research per se. What they basically do, it's an independent organization. It's actually a 501(c) nonprofit now. And it was established to provide some kind of oversight of the materials portion of the certification program. And so any manufacturer that makes a product that wants it to appear on the list has to submit samples of the product and any technical support and information research data to demonstrate what's in the product, what it's used for, and then a determination is made as to whether that product kind of makes the list. So this is the OMRI kind of manages the can and cannot list. If the product that you want to apply is on the list, then you're fine. If it's not on the list, there may still be opportunities to use it or possibilities to use it, but essentially it's off the list and you can't use it. The organic system plan is kind of a core component to this application process. And if you were any farmer or grower, attempting to grow organically, you'd want to have a plan in place. But basically the plan describes what you're doing and how you're going to deal with certain problems. And again, it's just an effort to make sure that you have some knowledge and abilities in this area, and you have some plan for what happens if your crop starts to get eaten by something or destroyed by something. What's your plan in place to kind of deal with those issues? For the land itself to be eligible, you've got to have records demonstrating that no prohibited substances, which basically means most synthetic fertilizers and pesticides, make sure that none of that has had anything on it for at least 3 years. And so you start the process by being in transition, and after a 3-year transition period, then in theory you can become a full certified organic. So if you purchase a piece of property and you can't get any history on it, then you kind of got to, in theory, have to go, be considered transitional for 3 years. Ideally, you can get the history in the land, and in many cases you can get verification that the land has been left alone, it's been fallowed, nothing's been grown on it, nothing's been sprayed on it, nothing's happened to it. If you're clearing land, well, that would be the case. But if you're taking over established land, then you've got to establish some kind of history on the property. And of course, all this is done through documentation of your management practices. In Georgia, if you register, then you're you kind of get on a list. And then, of course, anybody that's on that list then is subject to inspections. And it basically just it basically becomes a means for everybody to be in communication. So at any time, USDA can go to the agency in Georgia, the Georgia Crop Improvement Association, and they've got this list of which growers are on their list. And even the agencies certifying have to be registered as well. So they have to go through a process. So this is all about keeping up records and understanding who's doing what, who's taking responsibility, so that we don't have situations that you read about sometimes just in general in agriculture, of people not being careful about the use of pesticides, or there not being any oversight of runoff or erosion problems, or some poor practices or mishandling of animals or whatever. So it's all kind of a system of checks and balances. Currently, there's about 10,000 organic farms in the United States. There's been a continued expansion of organic markets. So, everybody kind of, at least the estimates are that there will be an increased demand for organic products. Organic markets have experienced approximately 20% annual growth over the last 10 years. So at least it's a growing market. It still represents a small amount of the market, but interestingly enough, over 50% of consumers that were surveyed report purchasing at least some organic products. So that's a pretty big market share, and it's a growing market share, and it's a good reason for producers and manufacturers to pay attention. Again, it still doesn't represent but a small percent. Some people estimate in Georgia, for example, that the organic market represents maybe 1%, at least in the vegetable arena, that there's only about 1% of the vegetables grown in the state of Georgia are organically grown. But there's also a recognition that the trend is for expansion in this area, and for larger growers. And in some cases, some of the smaller growers are dropping out, at least of the certification programs, in part because of the cost. And in many cases, if you're a small grower and you're selling to a local farmer's market, in many cases, the locals are content with knowing that you're a local grower and you're doing a good job, and they don't feel like you have to be certified. But if you sell your product as certified organic, you have to go through this process. There's no way around it, unless you are such a small farm that you can. There are ways. You still have to kind of be recognized, but there are ways out of some of those fees, and some of the process can be kind of shortened if you're smaller than $5,000 worth per year. But if you're trying to make a living at it, obviously $5,000 a year isn't much of a living. So anything over $10,000, you absolutely have to, if you're going to use that label. There's no way around it. You've got to go through the full process, pay the full fees, experience the full inspection, and so forth. And of course, processors also have to go through this process too. So there's kind of a similar process that they have to go through to get certified for selling or distributing organic products. So just a real quick summary, the NOP is the National Organic Program, and we'll refer back to this in subsequent lectures, particularly when we talk about pest control or fertilization, because because this is a class in organic gardening and that's the best set of standards we have to go by, I'll be discussing and recommending practices that would meet certification standards. So we'll refer back to both the National Organic Program and the OMRI as we kind of look for ways to look up materials to make sure they're on the list and so forth. And then if you use this seal, if you see this seal on, for example, processed food or bag of chips or whatever, that means that 95% or greater of the ingredients were in fact certified organic. So there's still a little bit of a loophole there. In theory, up to 5% of the ingredients could be non-organic.